Welcome to Chronicles of Old Tales, where we dig up the stories that time, and sometimes history itself, tried to bury. History, as it's often told, has a nasty habit of erasing women. For centuries, we've been handed a story of the Middle Ages where women were silent shadows, submissive figures sketched into the margins of a world run by men. It's a narrative carved in stone and painted in manuscripts. Women were either saints to be revered or sinners to be condemned. They were dutiful wives or wicked witches. They had no voice. We're told their lives were utterly dictated by the men who owned them: fathers, husbands, brothers, priests. Legally and socially, they were subordinates, their entire purpose confined to bearing children and running a home. This wasn't just a casual bias, it was the law. It was a deeply embedded worldview, a social and intellectual architecture built to systematically limit female power. The very word for history, *history*, seemed to prove the point. It was a world where a woman's power was a dangerous threat, her intellect a reason for suspicion, and her voice an unwelcome disruption to a so-called divinely ordained order. But what if that's a lie? Or, at the very least, a profound distortion? What if, deep in the heart of 15th century France, while the 100 Years' War raged and a suffocating patriarchy held its grip, one woman decided she'd had enough? What if, 600 years ago, a lone woman declared war on centuries of misogyny, not with a sword and shield, but with a pen and a bottle of ink? This is the story of a woman who, armed with little more than her mind and a desperate will to survive, built a fortress of words to defend her entire sex. She was a scholar, a poet, a political theorist, and a mother. She was also France's first professional female writer and a figure so far ahead of her time, we're still catching up to her. Her name was Christine de Pizan, and she was about to launch a literary war that would echo for centuries. To understand the revolution Christine de Pizan was about to ignite, you first have to understand the brutal reality of the world she was born into. It was a world of stark, cruel contrasts, especially for women. For the vast majority, life was an exhausting cycle of back-breaking labor, marriage in their early teens, and a constant, near unimaginable rhythm of pregnancy and childbirth. Peasant women toiled in the fields beside their husbands, tended livestock, and shouldered the crushing burden of the household, cooking, cleaning, spinning wool, and caring for the sick and dying. Their lives were physically punishing, and their autonomy was practically zero. For women of the aristocracy, the cage was just gilded. Noble women were spared the mud and grime of the fields, but they were trapped all the same. Their primary worth was as a political bargaining chip. Their purpose was to secure a dynasty by forging strategic alliances through marriage, often to men they'd never met, sometimes as young as 12 years old, and then to produce male heirs. While they might manage enormous households and wield a quiet, indirect influence, their legal rights were severely curtailed. An unmarried woman was the property of her father. Once married, she and her husband became a single legal entity, represented, of course, by the man. Education for women? Beyond basic religious instruction and the skills needed to run a household, it was almost unheard of and widely viewed with deep suspicion. Why would you educate a woman? It was considered not only unnecessary for her duties, but dangerous. It might fill her head with ideas above her station, make her question her role, or, God forbid, lead her into moral temptation. Into this world, around the year 1364, Christine de Pizan was born, not in France, but in the glittering Republic of Venice. Her story was an exception from the very first breath. She was the daughter of Tommaso di Benvenuto da Pisano, a renowned physician, professor, and astrologer. He was a man of immense learning and influence, and when Christine was just a child, he received an offer he couldn't refuse. King Charles V of France, known as Charles the Wise, invited him to be his court astrologer and advisor. The family packed up and moved to Paris, the intellectual and cultural heart of Europe, and settled into the sophisticated world of the French court. Here, inside the walls of the Louvre, then a royal palace, young Christine was surrounded by a universe of books, art, and vibrant debate that was closed off to nearly every other woman of her time. And here is where her story takes a truly radical turn. Her father, a man with forward-thinking, humanist ideas, held a belief that was practically heresy for the era. He believed a woman's mind was just as capable as a man's. Against the customs of the day, and supposedly over the loud objections of Christine's own mother, who wanted a traditional, domestic life for her daughter, Tommaso decided to educate Christine himself. He didn't just teach her to read and write. He gave her the kind of classical education reserved for boys destined for the church or university. He threw open the doors to his vast library, a treasure chest of knowledge that became her real home. She devoured history, science, philosophy, and poetry, mastering Latin and immersing herself in the great works of the ancient world in her own time. This wasn't the basic literacy taught in a convent. This was a deep, scholarly engagement with the world of ideas. Christine later wrote about the pure joy of this time, saying, "Ah, child and youth, if you knew the bliss which resides in the taste of knowledge, how well you are advised to not complain of the pain and labor of learning." This extraordinary education, a gift from a father who broke all the rules, was the foundation upon which her entire life would be built. It was the forging of the weapon she would one day need, though she couldn't possibly know it yet. At 15, as was expected, Christine was married. Her husband was Etienne du Castel, a respected and well-educated royal secretary at the court. Though the marriage was arranged, by all accounts, it was a genuine partnership, full of love and mutual respect. Much like her father, Etienne admired Christine's fierce intellect and actively encouraged her to keep writing and studying. For 10 years, Christine lived a dream life, a life of comfort, intellectual stimulation, and love. She was a wife, a mother to 3 children, and an active mind in the most cultured court in Europe. Her life seemed secure, privileged, and happy, but as she would later write with agonizing clarity, fortune is a fickle and savage wheel, and it was about to turn on her with a breathtaking, devastating cruelty. The world Christine de Pizan knew, a world of stability, love, and intellectual luxury, shattered with terrifying speed. The first crack appeared in 1380 with the death of her great protector, King Charles V. With the wise king gone, her father, Tommaso, lost his prestigious position at court, and his income dried up. He died a few years later, leaving the family in a financially precarious position. But the blow that truly broke her world came in 1389. While traveling on royal business, her beloved husband Etienne fell gravely ill and died, likely a victim of the plague. At just 25 years old, Christine was a widow. In a single, horrifying instant, her life was turned upside down. She was now solely responsible for her 3 young children, her aging mother, and a niece. In late 14th century France, widowhood was a treacherous state. While a widow technically gained a degree of legal autonomy a married woman lacked, this freedom was often a curse. She was suddenly plunged into a male-dominated legal and financial labyrinth, completely unprepared to navigate it. When she tried to collect the salary still owed to her late husband, she became ensnared in a nightmare of endless, draining lawsuits. Creditors circled like vultures. Men who had been friendly associates proved to be treacherous. She was a lady, a damoiselle, but she was also deeply vulnerable, a woman alone in a system designed to exploit, not support her. The medieval world saw an independent woman as a dangerous anomaly, a loose thread in the social fabric that needed to be tied down. Burdened by unimaginable grief and the threat of financial ruin, Christine fell into a deep depression, later writing that she wished for her own death. But she had a family to feed. She wasn't without options. Recognizing her formidable intellect, powerful men from abroad, including the Duke of Milan and officials from the English court, invited her to join their ranks. But Christine was fiercely loyal to France, her adopted home. She turned them all down, resolving to stay and fight. She could have remarried. That was the obvious, expected path for a young widow of her standing. But Christine made a decision that was almost unthinkable for a woman of her time. She would not place her fate, or her family's fate, in the hands of another husband. Instead, she would rely on the one thing that was truly hers, the one thing no one could take away, her mind. She would become a professional writer. At the time, the idea of a woman earning a living with her pen was utterly revolutionary in Europe. Writing was a gentleman's art, a pastime for nobles, or a devotional act for clerics. But Christine had a unique set of skills, a world-class education, an insider's understanding of courtly tastes, and the raw, desperate need to survive. She started by writing what she knew and felt most deeply. Her first works were elegant, lyrical ballads and poems about her lost love, heartbreaking tributes to Etienne. These were not just diary entries. They were brilliantly crafted works of courtly poetry, and they immediately caught the attention of the highest levels of French society. Powerful patrons, including the king's own brother, Louis I, Duke of Orleans, and the immensely wealthy Philip the Bold, Duke of Burgundy, began to notice her extraordinary talent. They commissioned poems from her, and her reputation exploded. She wrote hundreds of ballads, rondeaux, and other poetic forms, becoming a celebrated voice in French literature. But she wasn't just an artist, she was an entrepreneur. In an astonishingly modern move, Christine established her own workshop, hiring scribes and artists to produce beautiful, illuminated manuscript copies of her work. She personally supervised their production, ensuring the quality and controlling her own intellectual property. These luxury manuscripts were presented as exquisite gifts to patrons like Queen Isabella of Bavaria. Through sheer force of will, intellect, and business savvy, Christine de Pizan had transformed herself from a destitute widow into one of Europe's first professional female authors. She had survived. She had secured her family's future. But her greatest battle was still to come. She had proven a woman could succeed in a man's world. Now, she would have to defend all women from that world's most poisonous and deeply cherished lies. As Christine's fame as a poet and scholar soared, she was, by her own account, sitting in her study one day. She was surrounded by the very books that had been both her salvation and her livelihood. She picked up a volume by a writer named Matthias, a well-known satirical work about the miseries of marriage. As she read, a familiar, sick feeling began to crawl into her heart. The book was a torrent of misogynistic cliches, a laundry list of libels portraying women as shrewish, deceitful, lustful, and fundamentally broken. This was nothing new. Such ideas were the background radiation of medieval culture. But on this day, for some reason, it struck her with a new and devastating force. She started to truly wonder why so many supposedly learned men, poets, philosophers, church fathers, seemed to take such vicious pleasure in slandering an entire half of the human race. She wrote, "I was so amazed and so filled with shame that I could only say, 'O Lord, how can this be?'" She began to scan her own library, pulling down the works of famous and respected authors, one after another. And everywhere she looked, she found the same venom. It was in the satires of Ovid, in the arguments of the philosophers, and most powerfully of all, in the single most popular and influential literary work of the French Middle Ages, the Romance of the Rose. The Romance of the Rose was a 13th century allegorical poem, a cultural phenomenon that had captivated Europe for over a century. The first part, written by Guillaume de Loris, was a delicate, courtly tale about a lover's quest for his ideal love, symbolized by a rose in an enchanted garden. But the much longer second part, added 40 years later by a scholar named Jean de Meun, was something else entirely. While considered a work of literary genius, de Meun's section was cynical, vulgar, and virulently misogynistic. It was packed with long speeches from characters who depicted women as inherently deceitful, greedy, and sexually insatiable. Women were portrayed as gossips and manipulators whose only goal was to dominate and trick men. In one infamous section, the character of the jealous husband delivers a bitter rant claiming that all women, no matter their class or character, are naturally unfaithful. To many male readers of the time, this was just sophisticated satire, a clever literary game. But for Christine, it was a disgusting and dangerous slander against the character of all women. She knew from her own life that this kind of literature wasn't harmless entertainment. She wrote with fury about men who would read passages from the Romance of the Rose to their wives while beating them, using Jean de Meun's wisdom to justify their abuse. This book wasn't just words on a page. It was a weapon used to enforce the subjugation of women in the real world. Sitting in her study, feeling the crushing weight of centuries of literary hatred, Christine fell into a profound despair. She wrote that she cursed the day she was born, lamenting, "I considered myself most unfortunate because God had made me inhabit a female body in this world." She felt utterly alone, drowning in an ocean of vitriol spewed by the most respected minds in history. And it was in this moment of absolute darkness that her life and the history of women's literature changed forever. As she tells it, while weeping in her study, she was visited by a vision. 3 crowned ladies, shining with a heavenly light, appeared before her. They identified themselves as Lady Reason, Lady Rectitude, and Lady Justice. They came with a divine mission. The world of letters, they declared, was a city built by and for men, and its foundations were rotten with misogyny. It was time to build a new city, a city for women. This vision marked the symbolic beginning of a fierce, public literary war known as the Querelle de la Rose, or the Debate of the Rose. The conflict truly erupted around 1401, when Christine directly challenged a circle of influential male scholars and royal secretaries who revered Jean de Meun's work. A fiery public exchange of letters began. Her opponents defended the Rose as a masterpiece of satire, arguing that Christine, as a woman, simply wasn't capable of understanding its literary genius. They patronized her, dismissing her arguments as emotional and born of feminine pride. But Christine refused to be silenced. She met their scholastic arguments with razor-sharp logic and moral fire. She argued that art could never be divorced from its moral consequences. She called Jean de Meun's work vulgar, immoral, and a slander against all women. She famously countered the argument that such books were written to warn men about female wickedness by retorting that condemning all women to warn a few foolish men was like denouncing fire, which is a vital and beneficial element, just because some people are burnt by it. She wasn't just debating a book. She was challenging the entire authority of the male intellectual tradition. This was an act of almost suicidal bravery. She was a woman with no university degree, a widow whose very livelihood depended on the goodwill of powerful male patrons. Yet here she was, publicly taking on the entire intellectual establishment of Paris. This was the great debate of the age, the Querelle de Femmes, or the woman question, and Christine de Pizan had just fired its opening shot. The skirmish was over. It was time to build her fortress. The fight over the romance of the Rose had established Christine as a powerful public intellectual, a champion for her sex. But playing defense wasn't enough. She had to build something new, something that would last. Inspired by her vision and fueled by the fire of the Querelle, in 1405, she began her masterwork, Le Livre de la Cité de Dames, or the Book of the City of Ladies. This wasn't just another book. It was a revolutionary act of literary warfare and construction. Modeled on St. Augustine's famous City of God, Christine's book is a powerful allegory. In it, the narrator, Christine herself, sets out to build a magnificent, fortified city that will serve as an eternal refuge for all virtuous women, a place where their reputations will be safe from the poisoned pens of misogynist writers. Her guides and master builders are the 3 celestial ladies from her vision: Lady Reason, Lady Rectitude, and Lady Justice. The book is structured as a brilliant dialogue. Christine, the narrator, voices all the hateful accusations against women that littered the literature of her time. Then, one by one, the divine voices of reason, rectitude, and justice calmly and logically demolish them with a mountain of evidence. The construction begins with Lady Reason. She commands Christine to clear the ground for their city, which means digging up the dirty, black stones of lies and slander laid by male writers. Christine asks Reason the fundamental question: why have so many men written so much evil about women? Reason explains that it comes from many sources: the envy of men who have encountered women smarter than them, the bitterness of old age, the simple arrogance of showing off their learning, or from projecting their own vices onto women. Then, Reason helps Christine lay the city's foundations. The stones for these foundations are the stories of powerful, brilliant, and courageous women from history and mythology who excelled in traditionally male fields like politics, scholarship, and even war. Reason tells the story of Queen Semiramis of Assyria, who took command of her husband's armies and became a great conqueror. She tells of the Amazons, the legendary warrior women who governed their own kingdom without men, proving women were perfectly capable of leadership and self-defense. Reason also attacks the lie that learning is unnatural for women. The narrator, Christine, asks if girls were sent to school and taught the same subjects as boys, wouldn't they learn just as well? Lady Reason wholeheartedly agrees, stating that the only difference between the minds of men and women is that men have had far greater access to the school of experience. To prove it, she fills the city's foundations with stories of learned women: the great Greek poet Sappho, the Roman philosopher Cornificia, and Proba, a Roman noblewoman who composed a life of Christ using only lines from the poet Virgil. With the foundations laid and the strong outer walls erected, Lady Rectitude steps forward to build the city's houses and palaces. Her building materials are the stories of women known for their integrity, loyalty, and prophetic gifts. Rectitude is the voice of moral truth, and she counters the slander that women are morally weak and untrustworthy. She fills the city with honorable women, the pagan prophetesses known as the Sibyls, whose wisdom was sought by emperors, a Roman woman who secretly breastfed her own mother in prison to save her from starvation, and great rulers like Queen Blanche of Castile, who ruled France as a wise and effective regent. Rectitude also directly confronts the ugliest slanders, especially the vile accusation that women enjoy being sexually assaulted, which Christine, as narrator, calls a great villainy. Finally, with the city built and its houses filled, Lady Justice arrives to complete the work. She will install the city's queen and its most honored citizens, the female saints and martyrs of the Christian faith. Justice helps Christine place the Virgin Mary on the throne as the Queen of the City of Ladies, the ultimate symbol of female virtue, power, and grace. She then fills the city's highest towers with the stories of female saints who endured horrific torture and death for their beliefs. Women like Saint Catherine of Alexandria, who defeated 50 male philosophers in a debate before her martyrdom. These women represent the absolute peak of spiritual strength, the final, unanswerable refutation of the idea that women are weak in spirit. By the book's end, the city stands complete, a shining, indestructible fortress built from the collective achievements of women across all of history. It's a breathtaking vision, a symbolic home where women are celebrated, defended, and given their own history, written from their own perspective. In the final lines, Christine speaks directly to her female readers, urging them to take pride in their city and to defend its walls by living lives of virtue and intelligence. It was a call to arms, not with swords, but with character in mind. With this incredible book, Christine de Pizan had not just written an argument. She had created a legacy, a literary monument that declared, in the strongest possible terms, that women were not a divine afterthought, but a vital, equal, and glorious part of creation. With the Book of the City of Ladies and its sequel, The Treasure of the City of Ladies, a practical guidebook for women of all social classes on how to live virtuous and effective lives, Christine de Pizan cemented her position as one of the most important writers of her time. But what was the real-world impact of this magnificent fortress of ideas? Did it bring the walls of patriarchy crashing down overnight? Of course not. The misogyny of the medieval world was a disease far too deep-seated to be cured by a single book, no matter how brilliant. And yet, its impact was profound. First, it provided an intellectual arsenal for women and their allies. For centuries, the debate about the nature of women had been completely one-sided. As Christine herself noted, those who plead their case without an opponent can say whatever they like. With her work, she provided that opposition. She created a counter-narrative, a history women could point to, and arguments they could wield. Her books became foundational texts in the Querelle de Femmes, the woman question, a debate that she had effectively ignited and that would continue in European intellectual circles for the next 400 years. Her very success was a radical statement. She proved that a woman could be a serious public intellectual. Her work wasn't dismissed. It was read, copied, and debated by the most powerful people in France. Her patrons were the Dukes of Orleans, Berry, and Burgundy. The Queen herself, Isabeau of Bavaria, commissioned work from her. The Duke of Burgundy asked a woman to write the official biography of his dead brother, the late King Charles V. Think about that. It's a staggering testament to the authority she commanded. She was a respected expert on morality, statecraft, and even military strategy, operating at the very center of French political life. This recognition allowed her to live as Europe's first widely recognized professional female author. She wasn't an aristocrat writing for fun. She was a working mother who supported her entire family with her mind and her business acumen. The beautiful, hand-illuminated manuscripts of her work that survive today, some bearing her own handwritten corrections, show how deeply involved she was in the production and distribution of her ideas. She was, for all intents and purposes, her own publisher. As the years passed, France descended deeper into the chaos of civil war and the endless Hundred Years' War. Christine's writings became more political, filled with desperate pleas for peace. After the catastrophic French defeat at the Battle of Agincourt in 1415, a heartbroken Christine, now in her 50s, retired from the violent world of Parisian politics. She entered a convent at Poissy, where her daughter was a nun. For more than a decade, she fell silent. It seemed her incredible career had come to a quiet, prayerful end. But in 1429, astonishing news reached the convent, news that electrified all of France. A teenage peasant girl from a remote village, who claimed she was sent by God, had miraculously lifted the English siege of Orleans and was now leading the French army to one victory after another. Her name was Joan of Arc. For Christine, this was the ultimate, living vindication of everything she had ever written. Here was a woman, a young maid, leading armies and saving a kingdom, a real-life heroine stepping right out of the pages of her City of Ladies. She took up her pen one last time to write Le Dide de Jeanne d'Arc, the tale of Joan of Arc, a joyous, triumphant poem celebrating this real-life female savior. It is the only such literary work about Joan written by a known author during Joan's lifetime, a celebration completed just as Joan's victories reached their peak. It was the perfect final chapter to her life's work. Shortly after, around the year 1430, Christine de Pizan died, leaving behind a legacy as indestructible as the city she had built in her mind. In the centuries that followed, Christine's name would sometimes fade, but her ideas never vanished. Her books were copied and printed for over 100 years, influencing generations of writers. She was a landmark, a figure who had to be reckoned with. Today, scholars recognize her as a foundational figure in the long, arduous history of feminism. The term feminist didn't exist then, so she is often called a proto-feminist, but her arguments for women's education, moral equality, and their right to a public voice were centuries ahead of their time. Viewed through a 21st century lens, her work has its limits. Her focus was primarily on women of the nobility, and she didn't challenge the fundamental class structure of her society. But to judge her by our standards is to entirely miss the sheer radicalism of her achievement. In an age when women were defined by their relationships to men and their voices were systematically silenced, Christine de Pizan stood up and declared that a woman's worth lay not in her body or her husband, but in her virtue and her intellect. She argued for the simple, revolutionary idea that women were men's equals. The woman who sat weeping in her study, crushed by the weight of literary misogyny, did not just find her own voice. She forged a new one for half of humanity. She built a city not of stone, but of stories and arguments, a fortress of ideas that gave a defense to the accused, a history to the forgotten, and a powerful, enduring testament that a woman with a mind and a pen can, indeed, change the world. 600 years later, the walls of that city still stand. If you enjoyed this story of a historical hero who refused to be silenced, please subscribe to Chronicles of Old Tales for more deep dives into the lives of the most remarkable figures from the past. And let us know in the comments, who is another trailblazer from history you think deserves their own story? Thanks for watching.